The night Thomas Callaway died, the rain fell so hard, it turned the mountain trails into rivers of mud. He rode fast through the darkness, hunched low over his horse's neck, water streaming from the brim of his hat and soaking through his coat to the skin beneath. Behind him, through the black curtain of rain and pine, he could hear them. Three riders, three sets of hooves pounding the earth in pursuit, gaining ground with every stride. Thomas knew these trails better than any man alive. He had ridden them since boyhood, in sun and snow and starlight, mapping every switchback and creek crossing into the geography of his bones. But knowing the land and outrunning death were two different things, and tonight death had the faster horses. He reached into his saddlebag with one hand, fingers numb from cold and terror, and pulled out a small leather notebook. Inside were names, dates, and locations he had spent 3 months gathering. Evidence of what lay beneath Callaway soil and what powerful men were willing to do to take it. Thomas had been carrying the notebook for weeks, adding to it every night by candlelight, while his brothers slept, building a record that could bring down an empire. Lightning split the sky. In its white flash, Thomas saw the rocky outcrop ahead, where the trail narrowed between two walls of stone. He had seconds, maybe less. He shoved the notebook into a crack between the rocks, pushing it deep with fingers that already felt like they belonged to a dead man. The important thing, the land patent with the coded warnings he had scratched onto its back weeks ago, was already safe in his locked room at the ranch. If someone clever enough found it, they would know what to do. Thomas had made sure of that. He whispered 3 words into the rain, the same 3 words scrawled on the back of that hidden patent: not accident. 3 men, night. The sound of a pistol hammer tooling back cut through the rain like a blade through silk. Thomas looked over his shoulder one last time toward the ranch he would never see again, toward the brothers he had raised since their parents died, toward the life that was about to end on a muddy trail in the Montana darkness. Then he kicked his horse forward, and the night swallowed him whole. They found Thomas Callaway the next morning at the base of a cliff, his horse standing 200 yards away, with the saddle twisted sideways. Judge Harlan Crawford ruled it a riding accident, signed the death certificate before the ink was dry, and told the town doctor not to cause alarm. Nobody asked questions. Nobody dared. Not until 8 months later, when a young woman with cornflower blue eyes stepped off a mail-order stagecoach in Elk Ridge, Montana, carrying everything she owned in a single leather valise and a secret that would burn this quiet little town to its foundations. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and she had come a very long way to find the truth. The stagecoach rattled west through country that grew wilder with every mile. Clara sat alone on the hard wooden bench, her valise wedged between her feet, and a leather-bound law book pressed against her chest like a shield. Outside the window, the plains had given way to foothills, and the foothills were giving way to mountains so vast they made the sky look small. She had been traveling for 11 days. 11 days of dust, bad food, sleepless nights in relay stations that smelled of horse sweat and tobacco. 11 days of watching the civilized world shrink in the rear window until there was nothing left but grass and sky and the terrible freedom of having nowhere to go back to. Clara Whitfield was 22 years old. She had no family, no money, no home, and no prospects. 3 months ago, St. Catherine's Orphanage in Philadelphia had closed its doors for the final time, scattering 23 children into the wind like seeds from a dead flower. Clara, too old to be adopted and too young to have built a life of her own, had been given a newspaper with a circled advertisement and a piece of advice from Sister Margaret Go West. They need women out there more than they need to ask questions. The advertisement read, 3 brothers, Mountain Ranch, Montana territory. Wife needed for eldest. 700 acres, cattle solid log house. Requirements, healthy, hardworking, not afraid of loneliness. Contact Ethan Callaway, care of Elk Ridge, Post Office. Clara had written 3 letters before receiving a reply. Ethan Callaway's responses were so brief they bordered on rudeness. No romance, no promises, just facts: long winters, hard work, nearest town, 2 hours by horse. The final letter contained only 8 words and a banknote for coach, fare, money enclosed. Arrive October 15th, Ethan Callaway. She read those 3 letters over and over, not because they contained anything warm, but because they contained something rarer than warmth: honesty. Ethan Callaway promised nothing beyond the truth. After 6 years of hollow promises in an orphanage, Clara found that more valuable than any love poem ever written. But Clara had a secret she did not put in her letters. Her father, Henry Whitfield, had been a lawyer in Philadelphia. Not a rich or famous lawyer, but a small one who defended people who could not defend themselves. Immigrant families tricked into signing contracts they could not read. Widows whose homes were stolen by banks. Workers cheated of wages by employers who knew the law better than the men they exploited. Henry Whitfield fought for all of them, and for a while he won. Then his partner destroyed him. Victor Ashton. The name burned in Clara's memory like a brand on cattle hide. 10 years ago, Ashton had forged accounting records, framed Henry for embezzling client funds, and arranged his disbarment through friends in the right places. Henry lost his license, his home, his reputation, everything except his daughter in a leather-bound law book with an inscription on the first page for Clara. My beloved daughter who will reclaim the justice her father never lived to see. Henry Whitfield. He died 2 years later in a boarding house so wretched even the cockroaches avoided it, coughing blood into a handkerchief, while Clara held his hand and listened to the story of his betrayal through his broken, fevered whispers. She was 16. She carried his law book into St. Catherine's orphanage and read it every night by candlelight hidden under her blanket so the sisters would not see. She taught herself property law, contract law, mineral rights law, not because she dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Women could not practice law. She read because it was the only way she still felt close to her father. Every page she imagined his voice explaining the principles. Patient, steady, carrying the iron conviction that the law, even when abused, remained the best weapon humanity possessed to protect the weak from the strong. And somewhere in that process, without realizing it, Clara Whitfield became more knowledgeable about federal land law than most attorneys practicing on the Montana frontier. The second secret was simpler, but equally dangerous. In the hidden compartment at the bottom of her valise, Clara carried copies of the business records between Henry Whitfield and Victor Ashton. Evidence she believed proved Ashton had manufactured the fraud charges against her father. For 6 years, she had lacked the knowledge, resources, and opportunity to use them. Then in her final months at St. Catharines, she read a small article in the Helena Independent about the expansion of the Great Northern Mountain Railroad Company in Montana Territory, led by its president, Victor Ashton. The name hit her like a fist. The man who destroyed her father was building an empire in Montana. And when the mail-order advertisement from Montana Territory fell into her hands, Clara saw not just an opportunity to survive. She saw a chance to get close to her enemy. Elk Ridge appeared in the late afternoon light like a town that had been dropped from the sky and forgotten. It sat in a narrow valley between two ridges of the Rocky Mountains, small enough that Clara could count every building: Kincaid's General Store, Pearl Henderson's saloon and boarding house, a white clapboard church, a blacksmith shop, the post office, and the county courthouse. That last building caught Clara's attention immediately. It was too large for a town this size. Far too large. In every small settlement she had passed through on her journey west, the courthouse was usually a single room in the post office or the back of someone's barn. Elk Ridge's courthouse looked like it belonged to a city 10 times this size, and Clara found herself wondering who had paid to build it and why. The air carried the smell of fresh lumber, horse manure, and something sharper. Tension. Clara recognized it instantly because she had grown up in Philadelphia and knew the difference between a neighborhood at peace and one waiting to explode. Elk Ridge was waiting to explode. She saw it in the way people walked slightly faster than necessary, glancing sideways more than was natural. She saw it in the way a group of railroad workers sat outside Pearl Henderson's establishment, occupying an entire row of chairs with the territorial arrogance of men who knew nobody would challenge them. The man who met her at the coach station was not Ethan. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and with warm amber eyes and a smile that looked unfamiliar on his face, as though he did not wear it often enough for it to fit comfortably. He removed his wide-brimmed hat with a courtesy that seemed slightly awkward. Miss Whitfield's Silas Callaway, Ethan's brother. Silas explained that Ethan had business at the ranch without specifying what kind, then helped Clara onto a buckboard wagon for the 2-hour ride up the mountain. Clara watched him handle the reins with easy confidence, his body moving with the wagon as naturally as water moves with a riverbed. She noticed how he spoke to the horses in a low, patient voice, how his eyes continuously swept the horizon with the automatic vigilance of a man accustomed to watching for danger. Silas Callaway was a hunter, Clara realized. Not because he said so, but because his body moved like someone who always knew where he was in space, which way the wind blew and which sounds were normal and which were not. He talked enough for Clara to understand three things. He was the most approachable of the three brothers. He loved the ranch with a deep and genuine love, and he was hiding something heavy behind his smile. She recognized the third thing when the conversation turned to family. Ethan's the best man you could meet, Silas said, but don't expect him to tell you that himself. About Nate the youngest, Nate's going through a rough patch. Don't take anything he says personally. Then Clara asked, three brothers. Was there ever anyone else? The smile vanished from Silas's face like a candle blown out by wind. His hands tightened on the reins and his shoulders dropped half an inch. There were four of us, he said. Thomas, the eldest, died 8 months ago. The next two words came out flat, rehearsed, and entirely unconvincing. Riding accident. Clara noted the lie but did not press. She had lived long enough in an orphanage to know that truth reveals itself when it is ready, not when you force it. But she also noted something Silas did not say aloud, something she'd read in the way his jaw tightened and his eyes dropped to the reins. Guilt. Silas Callaway carried guilt connected to Thomas's death, and it was eating him alive from the inside out. The Callaway ranch materialized in the last light of the sunset. A large log house on a hillside, horse barn equipment, shed cattle fences stretching into the gathering darkness, beautiful and lonely like a fortress at the edge of the known world. Ethan Callaway stood on the porch. Clara's first impression was of a wall. Not a wall of wood or stone, but an invisible wall surrounding this man so completely that she felt its presence before she was close enough to see his face. He was enormous. Not just tall, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders wide enough to fill a barn door, but large the way mountains are large, silent, immovable, and giving her the distinct impression that no matter how hard she pushed, he would not budge. Miss Whitfield. Not a question. He nodded, stepped aside to let her pass. His eyes were the color of whiskey, and they looked at her without hostility, but also without warmth. With a deliberate emptiness, as though he had decided in advance that this marriage was a business transaction, and emotions had no place in the contract. Inside the house bore the marks of men living alone, solid but joyless, clean but soulless. No curtains, no flowers, no trace of anyone wanting to make this place a home rather than merely a shelter. The furniture was handmade, rough but strong. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its heat pushing back the mountain cold that crept through every crack and seam. Then Nate appeared. The youngest Callaway came from the back room with a whiskey bottle in one hand and a challenge in his eyes. Auburn hair and a tangle amber eyes like Silas's, but burning with something hotter and more dangerous. He looked Clara up and down with undisguised contempt. This is her city, girl. Wind would blow her away. How long you think she'll last out here? Nate. One word from Ethan, heavy as a hammer strike. Nate snorted, poured more whiskey, and disappeared onto the back porch without another word. Silas apologized for his brother and led Clara to her room at the end of the hallway. It was clean but carried the faint smell of cedar wood and old pipe tobacco. Thomas's room, though nobody said it. Clara knew because she saw old nail holes in the walls where things had hung, and because Silas looked around the room with the eyes of a man visiting a grave. That first night, Clara lay in the room of a dead man she had never met, listening to the wind howl through the cracks and coyotes calling from the dark ridges. She opened her father's law book, touched the inscription on the first page, and whispered, "I'm here, Father. I'll find a way." The wedding happened 3 days later. No flowers, no music, no guests beyond Silas, Nate, and a circuit preacher who had ridden half a day from the next settlement. It took place in the main room before the stone fireplace, with Clara wearing her navy blue traveling dress, the only nice dress she owned, and Ethan wearing a white shirt that looked like it was strangling him. The vows were brief and bloodless. Ethan said, "I do," in the voice of a man signing a business contract. Clara said, "I do," with a slight tremor she hid by lifting her chin. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Ethan touched his lips to Clara's forehead, so quickly she was not sure it had actually happened. That night, Ethan placed a neatly folded blanket outside Clara's bedroom door. "You sleep in the room, I'll sleep in the main room. When you're ready, we'll talk." Then he walked to the back porch, closed the door behind him, and left Clara alone with the realization that this marriage was entirely on paper, but also with an unexpected recognition. By keeping his distance instead of claiming his rights as a husband, Ethan Callaway was showing her a kind of respect she had not expected from an arranged marriage on the frontier. The first week, Clara found her footing the only way she knew how. She worked. She could not tell a heifer from a steer, but she could cook thanks to 6 years in the orphanage kitchen, and she did not complain. The first meal she prepared, beef stew with potatoes and fresh-baked bread, produced three distinct reactions. Silas praised it enthusiastically. Nate ate 2 bowls without a word, which was the only acknowledgement the youngest Callaway was capable of giving, and Ethan nodded. Just a nod. But it was the first nod Clara read as positive since her arrival. She began to understand the family. Ethan was the pillar. He worked from before dawn until after dark, carried every decision, and bore the pain of losing Thomas like a stone tied to his chest that he refused to acknowledge existed. One morning, Clara saw him standing alone at the edge of the west pasture, staring toward the valley below, motionless for nearly 30 minutes. When he turned and caught her watching from the kitchen window, his face sealed shut instantly, the invisible wall slamming up in a fraction of a second. But Clara had seen the moment before, a man in pain standing at the place where his brother died, allowing himself to feel it for just long enough before locking it away again. Clara realized then that Ethan Callaway was not cold. He was wounded. And the coldness was just ice he used to keep the wound from spreading, because if it spread, he feared he would break, and if he broke, nobody would hold this family together. That understanding changed how Clara saw him. He went from the cold man I was forced to marry to the strong man trying not to collapse. And that shift, small as it was, planted the first seed of something that would later grow into love. Silas was the glue. He held everything from falling apart with humor and kindness. But behind his smile lay shadows Clara did not yet understand. And Nate was a ticking bomb. He drank too much, fought in town, and openly declared he wanted to sell the ranch and leave for California. "Why does Nate want to sell?" Clara asked Silas one morning while they fed the chickens. "Because Nate thinks this ranch killed Thomas." Silas paused, and he's not entirely wrong. The words stayed in Clara's mind like a stone dropped down a well. She heard the echo but could not see the bottom. 2 weeks after the wedding, Clara began noticing things that did not belong. First, a small room at the end of the hallway between Silas's room and Nate's old room, always locked. When Clara asked about it, Ethan said only Thomas's workroom. No need to go in there. His voice carried the tone of finality that Clara had learned to recognize as meaning, do not ask again. Second, a stack of legal papers on the kitchen table that nobody read. Clara caught a glimpse before Ethan took them from her hands with an abruptness that bordered on rough. Business matters, not your concern. But what she had already seen stopped her heart for a full beat, the seal of the Great Northern Mountain Railroad Company, and beneath it a name that burned through her vision like acid. Victor Ashton, President. The man who destroyed her father was doing business with her new family, or more accurately, doing battle with them. Clara hid her reaction, said nothing, and resolved to learn more before revealing anything. Third, footsteps outside the house at night. Not Ethan's heavy tread, not Silas or Nate, lighter, more careful, as though someone was watching the house from the darkness. When she mentioned it to Silas, he said coyotes, without meeting her eyes. One evening, with all 3 brothers away, Clara found the spare key to Thomas's room hidden under a stack of dishcloths in the kitchen drawer. She opened the door and stepped into a space that had been sealed since Thomas died. Small, dusty, a wooden desk with drawers, a small bookshelf, and on the wall a geological survey map of the Callaway property marked with red ink at multiple points. Beside the map sat a wooden box containing numbered rock samples arranged with the precision of a man who valued order. Clara was no geologist, but she recognized quartz, and mixed among the samples flakes of metal that gleamed with the warm, unmistakable color of gold. She sat down on the dusty floor, legs crossed beneath her, and stared at those gold flakes in the candlelight with the feeling that the world had just tilted 15 degrees. She had grown up in Philadelphia, where every street child knew how to tell brass from real gold, because Market Street was crawling with men selling fakes. These samples were genuine, heavy, soft enough to scratch with a fingernail, glowing with that warm luster that no alloy could imitate. Gold. On Callaway land. And Thomas had known about it before he died. In the desk drawer, Clara found something even more important. Not a letter. Thomas had been too careful to leave a letter, Clara reasoned. A man who knew he was being watched would never leave evidence that could be easily read. Instead, she found the family's original land patent, the federal document granting the Callaways permanent ownership of 700 acres, including all mineral rights below the surface. On the back of this document, Thomas had written notes in a self-invented code that combined geological symbols with the names of landmarks on the property. Clara's brain, trained by years of reading complex legal texts, recognized the pattern immediately. She took paper and pencil from Thomas's desk, sat right there on the dusty floor, and began working. She compared the symbols on the patent to the geological map on the wall, cross-referencing abbreviations with terrain features she had observed during her first 2 weeks on the ranch. It took 3 nights. Each night after the brothers had gone to sleep, Clara crept back to Thomas's room with a candle and decoded another piece of the puzzle. By the third night, she had the full picture. The coded notes revealed exact coordinates of the gold deposit concentrated in the Western Valley near a natural rock wall. The name V. Ashton beside a danger symbol, a crossed X, the universal sign for threat. The name Crawford beside a $sign meaning bought, meaning corrupt. And a final line that made Clara's hands tremble so violently she nearly dropped the candle. Not accident. 3 men. Night. 3 men. 3 killers who had followed Thomas through the rain on a mountain trail 8 months ago. Thomas Callaway had known about the gold. He had known that Ashton wanted the land. He had known that Crawford was compromised. And most chilling of all, he had known he was going to die. He wrote his final message not on a letter that could be found and destroyed, but on the one document that his family would never throw away, the land patent itself. Only someone smart enough to recognize the code and desperate enough to search for hidden meaning would ever find it. Clara carefully replaced everything, locked the room, and returned to her own bed, where she lay awake until dawn, with her heart hammering and her mind racing. She now knew 3 things that changed everything. Thomas was murdered. There was a fortune in gold beneath the ranch. And the man responsible for both her father's destruction and Thomas's death was the same person, Victor Ashton. Ashton came to the ranch 1 week later. A black lacquered carriage pulled by 2 purebred horses, accompanied by 4 armed men who moved like professionals rather than ranch hands. The man who stepped down wore an expensive suit that had no place on a cattle ranch. Silver hair combed smooth and gray, eyes as cold as Montana winter steel. Clara watched from the kitchen window and recognized him instantly. She had stared at his photograph hundreds of times in her father's papers, memorizing that face the way a person memorizes the face of an enemy. Her heart pounded like a war drum, but she forced herself to stand still, dry her hands on her apron, and observe. Ashton offered to buy the ranch. $5,000, triple the market value. His voice was smooth and cultivated, the voice of a man more comfortable in boardrooms than on prairie grass. He mentioned the bank debt, the approaching taxes, the brutal winter ahead, each fact landing like a carefully aimed blow. When Ethan refused, Ashton smiled with the patience of a snake that knew its prey would weaken over time, and offered congratulations on Ethan's recent marriage. "I hope she won't have to endure too much hardship when winter comes." The threat lay beneath the courtesy like a knife beneath silk. As Ashton's carriage pulled away, Clara noticed one of his escorts, a weather-beaten man with a brown mustache, smoking a pipe. The tobacco smell drifted through the kitchen window, and suddenly Clara remembered something Silas had mentioned in passing during her first week. Nobody in the family smokes. But Thomas, according to Silas, had smelled of pipe tobacco on his clothes the night his body was brought home. Clara's mind connected the threads instantly. The pipe smoker rode with Ashton. Pipe tobacco on Thomas's clothes the night he died. Not proof, not yet. But the first thread in a web she was beginning to weave. That evening, after Silas and Nate had gone to sleep, Clara made the most dangerous decision since she stepped onto the stagecoach in Philadelphia. She sat across from Ethan before the fireplace and told him everything. She told him about the coded notes, the gold deposits, Thomas's final warning about 3 men in the night. She watched Ethan's face cycle through emotions like a storm crossing a valley. Disbelief, then shock, then rage, then a pain so raw that Clara had to look away for a moment to give him privacy. His large hands clenched on his thighs, knuckles white as bleached bone. He did not cry. Clara suspected Ethan Callaway had forgotten how to cry long ago, but his jaw clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grinding against each other. "Why didn't Thomas tell me?" His voice sounded like cracking stone. "Maybe he was trying to protect you, or maybe he didn't have time." Then Clara told him her own secret, about Henry Whitfield, about Victor Ashton, about the betrayal in Philadelphia, the forged evidence, the disbarment, the death and poverty. She told him she had carried evidence of Ashton's crimes for 6 years without the means to use it. I didn't come to Montana just for the advertisement. She admitted, her eyes on the fire rather than his face. I came because Ashton is here. I wanted to find a way to get justice for my father. She looked up at Ethan expecting anger. He had every right to be furious. She had concealed her motives, married him under false pretenses, brought her personal vendetta into his home. But instead of anger, Ethan studied her with an expression she had not seen before in his stone-carved face: respect. You know the law, he said, not a question, a confirmation. My father taught me everything he knew: land law, contracts, mineral rights. I can read legal documents, find loopholes, build arguments. I'm not a lawyer, women can't practice, but I can help you fight Ashton with his own weapon, the law. The silence stretched. The fireplace crackled. Outside, the wind moaned through the rafters. So this isn't just a practical marriage, Ethan said slowly. This is a war alliance, if you want to call it that. Something crossed his face. Not a smile, but the absence of coldness, and Clara understood that was significant progress. Clara persuaded Ethan to take her down to Elk Ridge. At the county courthouse, she examined public records while Ethan bought supplies and found two critical pieces of evidence. First, the shareholder registry of the Great Northern Mountain Railroad Company. Judge Harlan Crawford owned 15% of the very company suing the Callaway family. But Clara found something even more dangerous. Crawford did not merely hold shares. He received legal consulting fees from a shell company called Mountain Legal Associates, which Clara traced through the corporate filings back to Great Northern Railroad. This was not simple corruption through fake documents. This was a sophisticated bribery network disguised through layered shell companies, the kind of fraud that only someone trained to read financial ledgers would detect. Second, she met Doc Samuel Warren, the physician who had examined Thomas's body. The old man with the white mustache looked at her for a long time before answering her questions about the cause of death. I wrote that it was head trauma from a fall off a horse, but the wound was on the back of his skull, not the front or the side. Thomas was struck from behind, not thrown forward when a horse bucks. Doc Warren paused. I told Judge Crawford. He told me not to cause alarm. I obeyed because I was afraid, but I have not forgotten. Clara also met Pearl Henderson, the woman who ran the saloon and dining establishment and served as Elk Ridge's unofficial information network. Pearl, who never missed a chance to talk, told her that on the night Thomas died, there were rumors of strangers on the mountain trail, but nobody dared speak publicly. On the wagon ride back to the ranch, Clara's brain worked faster than the wheels. She had gold evidence, murder, motive, Crawford's bribery network, medical testimony, and a valid land patent. She was building a case. But she also knew that building a case and winning one were two entirely different things, especially when the local judge was the enemy and the opponent had enough money and power to bend the law to his will. That evening, with Ethan's blessing, Clara told all three brothers what she had found. Ethan's jaw clenched like iron. Why didn't Thomas tell me? Silas went pale. His hands began to tremble, and he set down his cup. I knew, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know about the gold, but I knew Thomas didn't die from an accident. He stopped, swallowed hard. That night, I was supposed to ride with Thomas to check the west fence line, but I was drunk, too drunk to get on a horse. Thomas went alone. He looked down at his hands, shoulders shaking. When they brought his body back, I smelled pipe tobacco on his clothes. Thomas didn't smoke. Nobody in the family smokes, but somebody near him that night smoked a pipe. Clara felt every piece click into place like tumblers in a lock. The pipe smoker with Ashton's escort. The tobacco smell on Thomas's clothes. Silas had been carrying evidence without knowing its value for 8 months, buried under a mountain of guilt. Nate stood up, kicked his chair across the room. I'll kill every last one of them. Ethan rose and blocked his youngest brother. No, not like that. If we use violence, we lose. They have more guns, more men, and the law on their side. Or at least the man sitting in the judge's chair is on their side. Nate looked at Clara. For the first time since she arrived, there was no contempt in his eyes. Only desperate hope. You said you know the law. Prove it. Clara answered with a calm she did not entirely feel. I will. But I need all of you to trust me. No fighting, no revenge. We beat Ashton with the system he thinks he's already bought. The room was quiet. The fire popped and hissed. Three brothers and one mail-order bride standing in a log house on a mountain in Montana territory, making a decision that would determine whether they kept their land, found justice for the dead, or lost everything. Ethan spoke first. "We fight." Silas nodded. "For Thomas." Nate, the angry one, the wild one, the one who had wanted to burn it all down and walk away, looked at Clara with amber eyes that still burned, but now burned in a direction rather than in every direction at once. "Tell me what to do," he said quietly. And those 5 words from the man who had called her City Girl and predicted the wind would blow her away meant more than any speech could have. Later that night, Clara stood on the porch looking at the mountains in the moonlight. The air was sharp with the promise of early snow, and she could see her breath in small white clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Ethan came out and stood beside her. He said nothing, but his shoulder blocked the wind, and his presence beside her in the darkness carried a weight that words could never match. It was the first time since her father died that Clara did not feel entirely alone. "We're going to fight," she said softly into the cold night. "We're going to fight," Ethan repeated. And his voice carried something new, not warmth. Ethan was still a long way from warmth, but commitment, solid as mountain rock and reliable as the dawn. Clara looked up at the vast Montana sky, thick with stars she had never seen in Philadelphia, and felt the strange, fierce certainty that she had found exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because for the first time in her life she had a purpose that mattered, people who needed her, and a fight worth winning. She tightened her grip on her father's law book. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Victor Ashton slept soundly in his expensive bed, confident that the Callaway ranch would fall into his hands like every other property he had stolen through corruption and violence. He did not know about Clara Whitfield. He did not know about the coded notes on the land patent. He did not know that the orphan girl in the navy blue dress carried weapons more dangerous than any gun. The truth, the law, and the unbreakable will of a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He would find out soon enough. Clara turned the kitchen table into a war room. She spread every legal document the ranch had received over the past 8 months across the rough wooden surface, sorting them by date, by sender, by type. Tax notices, road maintenance assessments, property revaluation orders, liens and claims and demands, all printed on official-looking paper, to stamps and seals that would intimidate any ranching family that did not understand the language of the law. Clara understood the language of the law. She had been reading it since she was 16 years old, whispering the words of her father's textbook under an orphanage blanket by candlelight. And what she found in these documents filled her with equal measures of fury and excitement. Fury at the brazenness of the fraud. Excitement at how poorly it had been executed. A tax notice cited a statute that did not exist. A road maintenance fee applied to a property that was not located on any public road. A revaluation order lacked the county assessor's signature. Each document, taken individually, looked terrifying to a family of ranchers who had never studied a law book in their lives. But to Clara's trained eye, they were cardboard painted to look like brick. One hard push and the whole wall would fall. She composed a formal letter of objection addressed to Victor Ashton, pointing out every error in every document with the methodical precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. She concluded with language her father would have approved. The Callaway family holds a valid federal land patent and will pursue all legal remedies necessary to protect their lawful property rights. She signed it Clara Whitfield Callaway, representative of the Callaway family. Ethan read the letter slowly, his brow furrowed with the concentration that Clara had come to recognize as his way of processing unfamiliar territory. "You think this will stop Ashton?" "No," Clara answered directly. "But it will tell him we're not easy to frighten anymore. And it will force him to change his approach, which will tell us how far he's willing to go." The answer came 3 days later. Not in paper, in blood. The east fence line was cut during the night. Clean cuts made with wire cutters, not the ragged tears of coyotes or weather. 20 head of cattle wandered into the valley. Ethan, Silas, and Nate spent 2 days rounding them up from draws and creek bottoms, riding hard from dawn until the stars came out. 5 days after that, someone opened the horse corral gate in the darkness. All 6 horses scattered. 5 found their way home before noon. The 6th, a chestnut mare named Whiskey, who had been Ethan's favorite since she was a foal, was found dead at the bottom of a shallow ravine 2 miles from the ranch. Her front legs snapped at an angle that made Clara turn away. Ethan stood beside the dead horse for a long time. His stone face showed nothing, but Clara saw pain in the way his jaw locked tight, in the way his shoulders curved inward just slightly, as though gravity had suddenly grown stronger. He knelt and placed one large hand on the mare's neck, and the gesture was so quiet and so private that Clara felt she was witnessing something she was not meant to see. A man saying goodbye. Not with words, but with touch. Not with tears, but with a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest from 20 feet away. She waited until he stood before she approached. "I'm sorry about whiskey," she said. Ethan looked at her. For one heartbeat, his eyes were not empty or guarded, but simply raw, and Clara understood that whiskey had been more than a horse. She had been a connection to the life before Thomas died, before the ranch started failing, before everything went wrong. And now that connection was broken deliberately and cruelly by men who calculated the cost of cruelty the way other men calculated the cost of feed grain. "They'll pay for this," Ethan said. Not loud, not angry, quiet and certain the way a man describes a fact rather than a wish. The threats became direct 1 week later. Clara was alone in the house. Ethan and Silas were at the far pasture checking on a sick calf. Nate was in town at the saloon, doing what Nate always did when the pressure built too high. She heard horses outside and looked through the kitchen window to see two men she did not recognize. They wore leather coats and carried sidearms, and they walked with the territorial swagger of men hired specifically to cause trouble. They did not knock. They walked straight into the horse barn, poked around for several minutes, then moved to the equipment shed. Clara picked up the rifle Ethan had taught her to use. He had started the lessons the week after the fence was cut with the brief explanation. "You need to know how to defend yourself when we're not home." He had shown her how to load, how to aim, how to hold the stock firm against her shoulder so the kick would not knock her backward. She was not an expert, but she could hit what she pointed at if the target was close enough. She stepped onto the porch. "What are you looking for on private property?" The two men turned. One of them, the taller one with a scarred chin, pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Judge Crawford sent us to conduct a property assessment." "Court order." Clara held out her hand. The man handed over the paper with a smirk that suggested he expected a ranch wife to glance at it, get confused, and step aside. Clara did not glance. She read every word, every date, every signature line, every reference number. And within 30 seconds, she found what she was looking for. "This order is dated yesterday but uses an assessment form that was replaced by a federal statute last March," she said. Her voice was steady, despite the fact that her heart was slamming against her ribs like a trapped animal. "Furthermore, a property assessment requires 21 days advance notice to the landowner. We received no notice. This order is invalid." The two men looked at each other. The smirk was gone. "You have two choices." Clara continued, keeping the rifle across her chest the way Ethan had shown her, not aimed at anyone but ready in an instant. "Leave now or stay, and I will record your names, the date and time, and the details of this unlawful trespass, which I will file with the territorial court in the federal prosecutor's office. Trespass on private property under Montana Territory Section 47 carries a penalty of up to 6 months imprisonment." The men left, reluctantly, with looks that promised this was not over. But they left. Clara waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded to nothing. Then she lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Her knees buckled, and she sat down hard on the porch step, the rifle across her lap, and her breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the realization of what she had just done. She had faced down two armed men with nothing but knowledge and a bluff. Because the rifle was part of the bluff, Clara was fairly certain that if those men had called her on it, she would not have been able to pull the trigger. But they did not know that, and the loss she cited was real, even if her willingness to shoot was not. When Ethan came home and heard the story, he looked at her differently. Not as the mail-order bride, not as the practical solution to a practical problem. As an ally. "You ran off 2 hired guns with a law book," he said. And Clara heard something in his deep voice that she had not heard before. A note of wonder, the kind a man makes when he realizes that the person standing in front of him is not who he assumed. But this small victory had consequences. Ashton now knew that Clara was not an ordinary farm wife, and he began investigating who she really was. The days between the confrontation on the porch and the trip to Fort Shaw saw a shift in the household that was as subtle as a change in wind direction and just as significant. Nate came home one evening with his right hand torn open and swollen blood seeping through a rag he had wrapped around it. Bar fight. He had punched a railroad worker who had said something about Thomas deserving what he got. Ethan and Silas were both away checking cattle on the North Ridge. Clara washed the wound, threaded a needle with steady hands she had trained in the orphanage, where no doctor ever came, and stitched the gash closed, while Nate sat at the kitchen table gripping a whiskey bottle with his good hand and staring at her with something between defiance and bewilderment. "You're not going to ask why I fought? I know why. You're angry about Thomas. Angry because there was nobody specific to be angry at until now. And angry because you feel helpless. You want to protect your family, but you don't know how. And the helplessness turns into rage, and the rage turns into a whiskey bottle and a fist." Nate stared at her. Nobody had ever spoken to him that directly. His brothers either lectured him, worried about him, or avoided him. Clara simply named what she saw without judgment, without flinching, without looking away. "You're not afraid of me." "I'm afraid of many things, Nate. Righteous anger isn't on the list. But I will be afraid if you let the anger turn you into something Thomas wouldn't want to see." That last sentence landed like an arrow. Nate looked down at his hand newly bandaged, with more care than anyone had shown his wounds in years, and Clara saw his amber eyes go bright for just a moment before he blinked hard and turned away. From that night forward, Nate stopped calling her City Girl. He called her Clara, and he began in small steps that nobody noticed at first to listen to her. Silas found Clara alone in the barn one morning and told her something she had not expected: the full story of his guilt. He described how Thomas had taught him to read by candlelight when they were boys, how Thomas had found him drunk behind the horse barn at 14 after their mother died, and sat down beside him without anger and said, "Silas' pain doesn't dissolve in whiskey, it just sinks to the bottom and waits for morning to come back bigger." "I remembered his words," Silas said, "but I didn't listen." He looked at Clara with eyes that held the particular agony of a man who has replayed the same night 10,000 times and changed the outcome in every version except the real one. "If I hadn't been drunk, I would have ridden with Thomas. And maybe two men on that trail would have been harder to kill than one." Clara put her hand on his arm. "Thomas was killed by bad men, Silas, not by your drinking. The guilt you carry is real, but the blame belongs to Ashton, not to you. And the best way to honor Thomas is not to punish yourself. It's to fight for the truth he died trying to protect." From that day, Silas did not stop drinking entirely. That would have been unrealistic, and Clara was wise enough not to demand miracles. But he drank less and less often, and never alone. The trip to Fort Shaw took 8 days round trip. Clara needed to file 2 documents with the territorial court: a complaint against Judge Crawford for conflict of interest and a request for a temporary injunction blocking the Great Northern Mountain Railroad from any action regarding Callaway land. These filings had to bypass Crawford entirely and go directly to the higher territorial authority. Ethan rode with her. Silas stayed to guard the ranch with Nate, and Clara saw Ethan pull his brother aside before departure and speak quietly. She guessed the instructions involved keeping the ranch secure and keeping Nate out of bar fights, though knowing Nate, the second task was considerably more difficult than the first. The first day they rode mostly in silence. Ethan was not a man who talked on the trail, and Clara respected that. She watched how he rode, straight-backed eyes, always scanning shoulders, perpetually ready for whatever the mountain threw at him. She also noticed that he never rode in front of her or behind her. He always positioned himself to her side, slightly offset toward whatever direction offered the greatest danger. Cliffside, forest side, the side an ambush would come from. He did this without thinking, out of a protective instinct so deeply embedded it had become reflex. On the second day, Ethan spotted parallel horse tracks on the trail. Someone was following them. He changed course immediately, guiding them onto paths his father had taught him as a boy. Hunting trails used by the Crow people for generations, invisible on any map, known only to those who had walked them on foot and memorized every turning. "My father called this the Ghost Road," Ethan said, one of the longest sentences he had spoken in 2 days of riding. "He said the Crow used it for 100 years to avoid their enemies." You learned a lot from your father, Clara said. The unasked question in her voice was, "Tell me more." The silence lasted so long she thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, and what came out was not just words, but a piece of himself that he had kept locked behind that invisible wall for years. My father, Ezra Callaway, was the first man to build on that land. Year of 1852. He came from Kentucky alone, 23 years old. One horse, one rifle, and a will that nothing on earth could break. He built the first cabin with his own hands, every log felled and dragged by one man's strength. First winter, he nearly starved. Second winter, he nearly froze. Third winter, he met my mother, Martha. She was a school teacher from an Oregon Trail party that got separated from the main wagon train. She had nowhere to go. He had nobody to live with. They married before the fourth winter came. Clara smiled. That sounds familiar. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time she saw something pass across his face that she could only call recognition. He understood the parallel. His parents had also begun with necessity, not love. And love had come later, slowly built on a foundation of shared winters and harvests. That night, they camped beside a creek, and Clara saw a different Ethan. Not the rigid man on the ranch, but someone who belonged to the wilderness, comfortable and confident in ways he never showed within four walls. He built a fire with economical precision, brewed coffee over coals, and when Clara asked more about his childhood, he told her about Thomas as a boy, how Thomas would read anything with words on it by candlelight, how Thomas had been the smartest of the four brothers, the one who could have become anything if he had been given the chance. Instead, he herded cattle and died on a dirt road. Ethan's voice cracked on the last word. Not a large crack, just a small fracture in the stone, but Clara knew it was the only fracture he allowed anyone to see. Clara said softly, Thomas fought in his own way. He discovered the truth and tried to protect his family. That is not a wasted life, Ethan. When the cold bit deep enough to make Clara shiver despite the fire, Ethan removed his leather coat and placed it over her shoulders without asking. The gesture was simple, natural, wordless, and it said more than any love poem ever written. On the third day, they were intercepted. 3 riders blocked the trail ahead. Hank Dawson, railroad foreman, and 2 workers. Dawson was a Civil War veteran, his face weathered to leather by decades of sun and hard living, and his eyes carried the particular wariness of a man who has seen too much violence to find it exciting anymore. Mrs. Callaway. Dawson's voice held reluctance, as though the words tasted bad in his mouth. Mr. Ashton asked me to deliver a message. If you file those papers in Fort Shaw, he will consider it a hostile act. Ethan moved his horse forward, placing himself between Clara and the 3 men. His hand rested on the saddle horn, not on his gun, but the shift in his posture was unmistakable. You want to block citizens on public land, Dawson? That's a federal offense. Dawson studied Ethan, then Clara, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not hostility, exhaustion. The bone-deep fatigue of a man working for the wrong side, not by choice, but because the world had not offered him a better option. I'm just delivering the message, Dawson said, pulling his reins to turn his horse. But as he passed Clara close enough that only she could hear, he spoke 4 quiet sentences that changed everything. 3 nights before Thomas died, I saw 2 strangers at the railroad camp. They weren't workers. They met with Ashton in his private tent for 2 hours. When they came out, one of them was smoking a pipe. Then Dawson spurred his horse and rode away, leaving Clara with a hammering heart and a new piece of the puzzle. The pipe smoker, the same man she had seen in Ashton's escort when he visited the ranch. The same tobacco smell that Silas remembered on Thomas's clothes, and now a witness who could place that man with Ashton days before the murder. They filed the papers in Fort Shaw successfully. The territorial clerk confirmed the court would review the case within 30 days. The retaliation began 1 week after they returned. A crew of armed railroad workers appeared at the western boundary, driving stakes and stringing surveyor's tape, claiming it was the approved railroad right-of-way. They carried an eminent domain order signed by Judge Crawford authorizing the seizure of private land for public railroad construction. Clara read the order. It was missing 4 legally required procedural steps: public notice, community hearing, independent appraisal, and landowner appeal period. She told the foreman as much. They withdrew, but not before leaving behind a thin threat. Mr. Ashton says you're quite stubborn, Mrs. Callaway. That night the barn burned. Clara woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the dog howling and a wall of orange light pouring through her bedroom window. She was on her feet and out the door before her conscious mind fully understood what was happening. Her body responded to the heat and the roar of flame while her brain was still assembling the facts. The barn was fully engulfed, not a small fire, not a stray spark from a lantern. This was the kind of fire that only comes from someone pouring kerosene on dry wood and striking a match. The flames reached 30 feet into the black Montana sky, throwing sparks like fireflies made of destruction, and the heat was so intense that Clara felt the skin of her face tighten from 20 yards away. Ethan was already outside, barefoot on the frozen ground, shouting orders to his brothers, with the commanding voice of a man born to lead in crisis. Silas, the well. Nate, the horses, get them away from the fire. The three brothers moved like a single organism. No questions, no hesitation. In a crisis, the Callaway men operated with the coordination of soldiers who had trained together their entire lives. Silas hauled buckets from the well and threw water on the walls of the main house, not to save the barn, which was already beyond saving, but to prevent the fire from spreading to their home. Nate dragged 3 panicked horses from the near corral, fighting their terror with a combination of raw strength and instinct, his voice a strange mix of fury and gentleness as he spoke to the animals. Ethan found the evidence almost immediately. 2 separate ignition points, one at the north corner and one at the south. Kerosene residue on the ground. Boot prints in the mud that did not match any Callaway foot. Kerosene, Ethan said, kneeling to smell the earth. 2 ignition points. Professional job. While the brothers fought the fire, Clara ran inside and grabbed the land patent, all the legal documents, and her father's law book. She remembered Thomas's coded warning. If the patent was destroyed, Ashton could claim the Callaways had no proof of ownership, and Crawford would happily agree. She stuffed everything into a leather bag, tied it shut, and carried it outside. Then she went back for the law book because she would not let any fire, whether sent by God or man, take the 2 most precious things she possessed. The barn burned to ash. It took 3 hours for the last flame to dwindle, and when dawn came, 4 people stood before a blackened ruin that represented months of stored cattle feed, farming equipment, seed grain for spring planting, and irreplaceable tools that had been in the family since Ezra Callaway built the ranch. Silas sat on the ground, both hands blistered from hauling hot water buckets too close to the blaze. Nate stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides, eyes red from smoke and rage. Ethan stood straight, looking at the ashes with his stone face. But Clara saw the pain in the slight drop of his shoulders, the almost invisible surrender of a man who was running out of things to lose. "Now what lawyer, girl?" Nate asked. His voice held no contempt anymore, only genuine desperation. "They'll keep going until we have nothing left." Clara looked at the ashes, then at the 3 men, then at the eastern sky where the sun was climbing over the mountains, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding in its light. "No," she said, "this is the biggest mistake Ashton has made. He just gave us proof of deliberate property destruction. Kerosene residue, boot prints, the timing right after I filed with the territorial court. This is retaliation, and retaliation is evidence of criminal intent." She turned to Ethan. "I need to go to town. Doc Warren can document the burns on Silas's hands as evidence of the fire. And I need Pearl Henderson." With Pearl Henderson. "Pearl knows everything that happens in Elk Ridge. If anyone saw strangers last night or bought an unusual amount of kerosene recently, Pearl will know. And Pearl talks. If she knows the truth, the whole town will know in 2 days." Pearl Henderson was exactly the weapon Clara needed. The woman who ran Elk Ridge's only eating establishment was loud, judgmental, and gossiped like a steam-powered printing press. But she had 2 qualities Clara could use. She hated injustice with the instinct of a woman who had been beaten by her first husband before she threw him out and built her business with her own 2 hands, and she possessed an intelligence network that no government agency could rival. Pearl knew who bought what, who said what, who slept where, and who went where at what hour. Not because she spied, but because the entire town ate at her table. They burned the Callaway boys' barn. Pearl's face turned crimson. "While winter is coming with all their feed stores inside, that's not business. That's murder by seasons." Pearl also delivered a critical piece of operational intelligence. "Night of the fire, 2 strangers drank beer at my place until 10 o'clock or so, then rode north toward the mountains. They paid in new silver coins, not farm money. and one of them bought 2 gallons of kerosene at Kincaid's store that afternoon. Kincaid told me because he thought it was strange. Who needs 2 gallons of kerosene in the middle of October? Clara wrote down every detail. Names, dates, times. She was beginning to understand that Pearl Henderson was not merely a source of gossip, but a living archive of everything that happened in Elk Ridge, and every piece of information she provided was another brick in the wall of evidence. Clara also visited other families Ashton had pressured to sell. The Morrisons, who lost their ranch after a mysterious fire 2 years earlier. Old man Jedediah Patterson, who lost 30 acres after Crawford ruled against him in a boundary dispute. Other families silent out of fear, but simmering beneath the surface. Patterson was the one who surprised Clara most. 72 years old, back bent by time, but eyes sharp as polished steel and memory like iron. When Clara introduced herself, the old man stared at her and said, "Whitfield, Clara Whitfield. You any relation to Henry Whitfield from Philadelphia?" Clara nearly dropped her notebook. "You knew my father." "Knew him. Henry Whitfield was my lawyer 15 years ago when I lived in Philadelphia. He helped me keep my house when the bank tried to take it. Most honest man I ever met." Patterson sat up straight, eyes blazing. "And Victor Ashton is the snake who destroyed him. I know because I was there. I saw what Ashton did. But when I wanted to testify, my wife was gravely ill, and I had to choose between fighting for Henry and caring for my wife." His voice dropped low. "I chose my wife, and I've regretted it for 15 years. Clara took the old man's hand. "You have a chance to make it right, Mr. Patterson, at the trial." Patterson nodded, slow but certain. "Tell me what you need." Victor Ashton came to the ranch for the final time on a gray afternoon when the sky hung low with the weight of approaching snow. He rode horseback this time, followed by 4 armed men, and he did not come to negotiate. "Clara," his voice was silk over steel. "Or should I say Miss Whitfield, daughter of Henry Whitfield, the lawyer disbarred for fraud in Philadelphia." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her blood went cold. Ashton had investigated her. He had found the connection to her father. And he would use it as a weapon because if the territorial court learned that Clara was the daughter of a convicted fraud, every legal argument she had built would be painted as personal revenge rather than pursuit of justice. "Your father was disbarred because he was a fraud," Ashton said, his smooth voice carrying the confidence of a man playing a winning card. "And you came here not to be a wife, but to take revenge on me. That makes everything you've filed with the territorial court look rather suspicious, doesn't it? A woman with a personal vendetta using a marriage of convenience to attack a reputable businessman. I think the court will find that story very interesting." Ethan stepped out of the house and stood beside Clara. His shoulder touched hers, a gesture of protection that every man in the yard understood. "Clara's past doesn't change the fact that you're trying to steal our land, Ashton, or the fact that Thomas was murdered." Ashton's face went pale for an instant before his composure returned. "Serious allegations, Ethan. I hope you have evidence. Because slander is a criminal offense, and Judge Crawford is not patient with slanderers." He turned his horse and rode away. The threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. After Ashton left, Clara sat on the porch steps with her face drained of color. "He'll use my father's past to destroy the case. Everything I've built, all the evidence, he'll frame it as a vendetta." Ethan sat beside her. "Then we find another way." "What way?" "Evidence that has nothing to do with you or your father. From independent sources. Things Ashton can't dismiss as revenge." Clara looked at him and saw iron determination in those whiskey-colored eyes. Ethan Callaway, the man she had once thought knew nothing beyond cattle and timber, had a strategic mind that his silence had hidden from the world. "We need Maggie," Clara said suddenly. "Thomas's wife. If Thomas told anyone about the gold and the danger before he died, it would have been her. And her testimony can't be dismissed as personal vendetta. She has no connection to Ashton or my father. Maggie left right after the funeral. Nobody knows where she went. And then we find her. Nate volunteered to go to Butte, where a friend at the saloon had heard that Maggie was living under her maiden name working as a seamstress. It was the first time Nate had volunteered for anything constructive since Clara arrived, and she saw Ethan look at his youngest brother with a surprise he tried to hide behind his habitual stone expression. Clara wrote a letter to the deputy marshal's office in Helena, reporting Crawford's conflict of interest and the pattern of property destruction. She did not know if the letter would reach honest hands. Ashton might have compromised the postal system itself, but she had to try every channel. Silas wrote out a detailed sworn statement describing the night Thomas died, the pipe tobacco smell, his own drunkenness, the guilt he had carried for 8 months. He signed it under oath, his hand trembling, but his eyes steady. For Thomas, he said. Doc Warren prepared a formal medical report contradicting the accident, finding knowing it could cost him his position if Crawford retaliated. I've been silent too long, the old doctor told Clara. I won't carry that silence to my grave. Pearl Henderson, with her natural gift for amplification, had already turned the Callaway story into the hottest topic in Elk Ridge. The town whispered, was Thomas's death really an accident? Was Ashton stealing land? Was Crawford corrupt? The silence was cracking, and light was beginning to reach the dark corners that Ashton needed to keep hidden. The night before Nate left for Butte, Ethan came to Clara's door. It was late. The fire in the main room had burned down to embers, and the only light came from the candle Clara had been using to review her legal documents. She opened the door and found him standing in the hallway, his massive frame filling the narrow space, his face half in shadow and half in warm candlelight. Clara. Her name and his voice carried something new, a tenderness he had never allowed before, as though the syllables themselves had been softened by a change happening deep inside him. Whatever happens from here forward, I want you to know something. He paused. Ethan Callaway, who could face grizzly bears and blizzards without flinching, was struggling with a sentence. The day you stepped off that stagecoach in Elk Ridge was the best day of my life. I was just too foolish to see it sooner. Clara felt tears rise without warning, not from sadness, from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that this man, this wall of stone and silence, had been changing since the moment she arrived. Slowly, invisibly, the way glaciers move, but moving nonetheless towards something neither of them had expected when they signed their names on a marriage certificate in front of a fireplace. That was the best day of my life too, Ethan. He stepped closer. His hand rose and touched her cheek, his palm rough and calloused from decades of ranch work, but his touch as gentle as if he were handling something infinitely fragile. He leaned down. His forehead rested against hers. She felt his warm breath on her face and heard his heartbeat slow and steady, close enough to count. The moment stretched suspended in candlelight and silence, closer than close, but still not crossing the final distance. Sleep well, Mrs. Callaway, he whispered. Then he was gone. His footsteps, lighter than she had ever heard them, faded down the hallway. Clara closed the door, leaned her back against the wood, and smiled, the first completely happy smile since the day her father died. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow clouds gathered over the mountains. Somewhere in the darkness, Victor Ashton was planning his next move, confident that money and power would crush this stubborn ranch family the way they had crushed every obstacle in his path for 20 years. He did not know that the woman he was trying to destroy had already assembled the evidence that would bring his empire down. He did not know that a reluctant railroad foreman had whispered the name of the pipe smoker. He did not know that an old man named Patterson had waited 15 years for the chance to set right a wrong he had been too afraid to fight. He did not know that a federal deputy marshal in Helena had received a letter and was reading it with growing interest. And he did not know that tomorrow morning, the youngest Callaway brother, the angry one, the wild one, the one everyone had written off as nothing but whiskey and fists, would ride south toward Butte to find the one witness whose testimony could not be dismissed, could not be discredited, and could not be bought. The pieces were falling into place, not by luck. By the stubborn, methodical, relentless work of a 22-year-old orphan who had taught herself the law by candlelight and carried her father's dream of justice across 1,000 miles of American wilderness. The trial was coming, and when it came, Clara Whitfield Callaway intended to win. Nate Callaway had been gone for 10 days. 10 days in which the first real snow of winter fell on Elk Ridge, dusting the mountains white and turning the ranch roads into frozen ruts that made every trip to town a small act of endurance. 10 days in which Clara barely slept, spending her nights at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents, building her case line by line, page by page, the way a mason builds a wall, one stone at a time. 10 days in which Ethan kept the ranch running through sheer willpower, mending fences, in the bitter cold, hauling water, when the creek froze, feeding cattle from dwindling reserves that the burned barn could no longer shelter. On the 11th day, Clara heard hooves on the frozen ground outside and looked through the frost-covered window to see two riders approaching from the south, Nate on his familiar sorrel gelding, and behind him, on a borrowed mare that looked too thin for the mountain trails, a woman. Margaret Pruitt, Maggie, Thomas Callaway's widow. She was 35 years old but looked older. Gaunt. Her brown eyes carried the permanent wariness of a hunted animal scanning the ranch yard in quick, darting movements, as though searching for threats behind every fence post and water trough. When she dismounted, her hands trembled so badly she could barely grip the saddle horn, and her legs buckled slightly before she steadied herself with visible effort. Nate helped her toward the house with a gentleness that Clara had never seen from the youngest Callaway. Not the rough, explosive energy he brought to everything else in his life, but a careful, almost tender attention, the way a man handles something he knows is fragile and important. Clara recognized the change in him instantly. Something had shifted during those 10 days on the road. Later, when Clara found a moment alone with Nate, he told her what had happened in Butte. Maggie had been living in a single room above a fabric shop, working as a seamstress under her maiden name, eating barely enough to stay alive because every dollar spent meant one more day she might be noticed, found dragged back to whatever fate she had been running from since the night Thomas died. When I knocked on her door, she nearly fainted, Nate said. His voice carried something new, an unfamiliar softness that sat oddly but not unpleasantly alongside his usual roughness. She thought I was someone sent to kill her. I had to sit in the hallway and talk through the closed door for 2 hours before she would open it. 2 hours, Clara. I told her about the ranch, about Ethan, about you. I told her we knew Thomas was murdered and we were going to do something about it. He paused. She opened the door, crying. Clara studied Nate's face and saw what the trip to Butte had done to him. He had spent 10 days responsible for someone other than himself. Someone weaker, more frightened, more damaged than he was. And in caring for Maggie and coaxing her out of hiding and protecting her on the long ride north through early winter weather, Nate had discovered something that whiskey and bar fights had never given him: purpose. Around the kitchen table that evening, Maggie told her story. She spoke in a voice that started as a whisper and gradually found strength the way a creek trickles after the first thaw before building into something that can move stones. Thomas had told her everything. The gold deposits in the Western Valley, Ashton's interest in the land, the growing danger. She described the last night with her husband, his face tight with fear, as he pressed a small wooden box into her hands and told her to keep it safe. He said if he didn't come back before morning, I should take the money under the pillow and go. Go immediately. Don't look back. Don't tell anyone. Maggie's voice cracked. Thomas didn't come back, and I did exactly what he said. I've been running for 8 months. Clara saw the brothers react differently. Ethan stood motionless by the fireplace, his jaw set like iron, processing the confirmation of what he had already suspected with the disciplined control of a man who does not allow grief to interfere with necessary action. Silas stared at his hands, his shoulders hunched with the weight of guilt that Maggie's words made heavier, because now he knew exactly what Thomas had been facing the night Silas was too drunk to ride with him. Nate watched Maggie with those amber eyes that no longer burned with unfocused anger, but with something directed and purposeful. But Maggie had not finished. She reached into the canvas bag she had carried from Butte and produced a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 2 rough nuggets of gold ore, heavy and unmistakable, and a slip of paper with a name and address written in Thomas's careful handwriting, Professor James Tully, Helena School of Mines. Thomas sent rock samples to this man 3 months before he died, Maggie explained. He received a report confirming the gold deposit was substantial, high-grade ore over a significant area. She looked at Clara. Thomas said the report was his family's life insurance. He said as long as someone outside the family had proof of the gold, Ashton couldn't make it disappear. Clara took the box with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the understanding of what she was holding. This was the final piece. An independent geological analysis from a respected academic institution, conducted by a third party with no connection to Clara, no connection to her father, no personal vendetta against Ashton. Evidence that could not be dismissed, discredited, or explained away. Combined with Doc Warren's medical testimony, Silas's sworn statement about the pipe tobacco, the corporate records proving Crawford's bribery network, Dawson's account of strangers meeting with Ashton before Thomas's death, and the testimony of families like the Morrisons and Patterson who had suffered Ashton's predatory tactics. Clara now possessed something she had scarcely dared to hope for: a complete case. Maggie had one more revelation. Thomas said Ashton had done the same thing in at least 3 other places. Buying land cheap by forcing people to sell, sometimes through legal pressure, sometimes through violence. Thomas said if someone dug deep enough, they would find a trail of victims stretching from Montana to Wyoming. Clara and Ethan exchanged a look across the candlelit table. This was no longer just about one ranch. This was the chance to expose a systematic pattern of criminal activity spanning years and state lines. Clara spent 2 weeks preparing for the trial with the focused intensity of a soldier preparing for a battle she could not afford to lose. She organized her case into 3 separate arguments, each strong enough to stand alone but devastating in combination. The first argument established the Callaway's legal ownership through the federal land patent, a document that no county court order could override. The second argument documented systematic fraud, the chain of fabricated legal notices, Crawford's bribery network through the Mountain Legal Associates shell company, and the pattern of coerced land sales across multiple families. Silas helped by playing the role of a hostile judge, sitting on a kitchen chair with a wooden spoon for a gavel, asking the hardest questions he could think of. Do you have a law degree? No. Then what gives you the authority? Section 12 of the Montana Territory Civil Code, which permits property owners or family representatives to speak in civil disputes. Do you have a personal grudge against the defendant? Clara hesitated on this one, and Silas pointed the spoon at her. That's your weak spot. You need a better answer. Clara spent an entire sleepless night finding it. By morning she had the words, "My personal connection to Mr. Ashton does not change the truth of the evidence. The geological analysis is not affected by my father's history. Doc Warren's medical report is not altered by my family background. The corporate records are public documents that do not depend on who finds them. Truth is truth regardless of who presents it." Nate contributed in his own way. He spent his evenings at Pearl Henderson's establishment talking to the ranchers and miners and laborers who gathered there, using the social influence he had built through years of drinking and fighting for the first time in a constructive direction. "You know what Ashton is doing to our land?" he asked, and the story spread from the saloon to the market, from the market to the church, from the church to every homestead in the valley. The silence was cracking, and Elk Ridge was beginning to talk. Ethan kept Clara going during the long nights of preparation. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, mending harness leather or sharpening tools, saying nothing but providing the steady anchor of his presence. When she was too exhausted to write, he gently took the pen from her fingers and said, "Morning, Clara. You need rest." And in those moments when his calloused hand brushed hers, reaching for the pen, when his eyes looked at her with a concern he no longer tried to hide, Clara felt the marriage contract transforming into something her father's law books had no words for. One night, reviewing the section about Thomas's death, Clara began to cry without realizing it. Tears fell on the paper, blurring the ink as she wrote about a man she had never met, but felt she knew through everything he left behind. His coded notes on the land patent, his geological samples carefully numbered and stored the fear and courage embedded in his final actions. Thomas Callaway had lived and died for the truth just like her father, and writing about him felt like writing for both of them. Ethan heard her crying. He stood, walked around the table, pulled a chair beside hers, and sat down. He did not speak. He did not say, "Don't cry." He sat there, shoulder against her shoulder, a living wall between her and the world, and let her weep until the tears ran out. When Clara looked up, wiping her eyes, Ethan said 3 words very softly. "Thomas would have liked you." Simple words, but they carried something enormous: complete acceptance. Ethan was not just acknowledging Clara as his wife. He was accepting her as family, worthy of the love Thomas would have given her if he had lived. And for Clara, that acceptance was more precious than any declaration of love could ever be. The morning of the trial, Elk Ridge woke to find its courthouse already surrounded by people. Word had spread through Pearl Henderson's information network, through Nate's saloon conversations, through the quiet whispers of families who had suffered under Ashton's shadow and were now watching, waiting, hoping that someone would finally say out loud what they had all been thinking in silence. Ranchers came from 20 miles away. Miners left their claims for the day. Women packed baskets of food as though attending a county fair, though the event they had come to witness was far more consequential than any fair. The courtroom filled to capacity and then beyond. Men stood along the walls. Women crowded the gallery. Children were sent outside to play in the early December snow, though more than a few pressed their noses against the windows to watch the drama unfolding inside. Victor Ashton arrived with his attorney, Cornelius Drake, a silver-haired lawyer from Helena, known throughout the territory as the Snake, for his ability to twist the law into shapes its authors never intended. Drake had won cases that should have been unwinnable and destroyed opponents who should have been untouchable. His presence in Elk Ridge told Clara that Ashton was taking this seriously, that the smooth confidence he had displayed during his ranch visits was beginning to fracture beneath the surface. Judge Harlan Crawford took his seat on the bench with an expression of irritated authority, the look of a man who controlled this courtroom and everything that happened within it. He rapped his gavel and called the proceedings to order. Clara stood at the front of the courtroom, her father's law book on the table beside her and the federal land patent in her hand. She wore the navy blue traveling dress, the same dress she had worn the day she stepped off the stagecoach, the same dress she had married Ethan in. It was the only good dress she owned, and she had pressed it that morning with an iron heated on the kitchen stove until every wrinkle was gone, because today she was representing not just the Callaway family but the memory of Henry Whitfield and the principle that the law belongs to everyone, not just to those who can afford to buy it. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the table to steady them. Then she began. Your Honor, before presenting the substance of this case, I have a procedural request. I am asking that Judge Crawford voluntarily recuse himself from these proceedings due to a direct conflict of interest. The room went silent. Crawford's face darkened. From the front row, Ashton sat motionless, but Clara, who had learned to read body language from months of living with Ethan, saw his jaw tighten and his hands clench on his knees. Clara produced copies of the corporate shareholder registry of the Great Northern Mountain Railroad Company. But she did not stop at the simple fact of Crawford's 15% ownership. She laid out the full network, the shell company called Mountain Legal Associates, the consulting fees that flowed from the railroad through the shell company to the judge's personal accounts, the dates and amounts that corresponded precisely to rulings Crawford had made in the railroad's favor. She placed each document on the table before the bench building. The picture of corruption, piece by piece, the way her father had taught her through his textbook. Never overwhelm the court with everything at once. Build the case brick by brick and let the audience see the wall rising. Judge Crawford does not merely own shares in the company that is a party to this dispute. Clara said, her voice carrying the steady register she had practiced. He receives regular payments through a corporate structure specifically designed to disguise their origin. This is not passive investment. This is active financial partnership with the party seeking to acquire Callaway land. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Crawford pounded his gavel, his face shifting from irritated to something closer to alarmed. He looked at Ashton. Ashton looked at Drake. Drake was already on his feet. Clara turned to face the gallery, the ranchers and miners, and townspeople of Elk Ridge, and spoke directly to them. You are here today not just to watch. You are here because what happens to the Callaway family can happen to any family. If a corporation has enough money and a judge has enough shares, then no ranch, no homestead, no piece of honest ground is safe. The whispers became nods. Clara saw Pearl Henderson in the third row, her eyes blazing, her mouth moving rapidly as she transmitted information to the people beside her like a telegraph made of flesh. Your Honor. Drake rose with the smooth confidence of a man who had talked his way out of worse situations. This woman has no legal standing to make procedural motions. She is not an attorney. She has standing. A new voice sharp with authority cut through the courtroom from the back doors. Every head turned. A middle-aged man in a federal uniform walked up the center aisle with the measured stride of someone who carried power but did not need to display it. Deputy Marshal Frank Booker, a silver star on his chest, federal jurisdiction in his pocket. The Office of the Territorial Attorney General of Montana has directed me to oversee this proceeding, Booker announced, producing a document with an official seal, based on a complaint received regarding potential judicial conflicts of interest. Clara's letter had reached the right hands. Her desperate gamble sending a complaint to Helena without knowing whether it would land on an honest desk or a corrupted one had paid off. Booker presented the federal order requiring Crawford to step aside and designating Booker himself as temporary presiding authority. Crawford protested. He cited jurisdictional boundaries, procedural requirements, the presumption of judicial independence. But federal authority trumps territorial authority, and Crawford knew it. He left the bench with the gray, shrunken expression of a man watching his world collapse in public, his expensive robe suddenly looking less like a symbol of power and more like a costume that no longer fit. The trial continued under Booker's supervision. Clara presented her witnesses in ascending order of impact, saving the strongest for last. Doc Warren came first. The old physician with the white mustache took the witness stand with the gravity of a man performing a duty he should have performed 8 months ago. He described Thomas Callaway's injuries in clinical detail, the wound on the back of the skull inconsistent with a forward fall from a horse, consistent with a blow from behind. When Drake cross-examined challenging Warren's qualifications as a forensic expert, the doctor responded with quiet dignity, "I have examined over 300 bodies in 30 years of practice, including 16 cases of cranial trauma. I know what a fall injury looks like, and Thomas Callaway's wound was not from a fall." Silas came second. He walked to the stand with his shoulders tight and his eyes red, but when he began speaking, his voice found a steadiness that surprised everyone, perhaps including himself. He described the night Thomas died, his own drunkenness, the guilt of not riding with his brother, and most crucially, the smell of pipe tobacco on Thomas's clothes when the body was brought home. "Nobody in our family smokes," Silas said, "but somebody near Thomas that night smoked a pipe." When Drake asked whether a drunk man's sense of smell could be trusted, Silas looked the lawyer directly in the eye and answered, "I was too drunk to sit a horse, but I remember the smell of pipe tobacco on my brother's coat more clearly than anything I have ever smelled in my life, because that was the last time I was close to Thomas." The courtroom went still. Pearl Henderson pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve. 2 ranchers in the back row looked at the floor and worked their jaws. Maggie came third. Thin, frightened, but carrying herself with the particular strength of someone who has been running long enough and has decided to stop. She presented the gold ore samples and Professor Tully's geological analysis from the Helena School of Mines, an independent scientific document confirming the presence of significant gold deposits on Callaway land. She described Thomas's final night, his fear, his instructions to flee, his conviction that the gold discovery had made him a target. When she spoke his last words to her, "If I don't come back before morning, take the money and go," her voice broke, and in the gallery, hardened ranchmen who had not cried since their own fathers died turned their faces to the wall. Then came the moment that no one expected. Clara called Hank Dawson to the stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dawson was Ashton's man, the railroad foreman, the last person anyone expected to testify against his own employer. But Dawson walked to the witness stand with the straight-backed bearing of a Civil War veteran, hearing the bugle one final time, and his weathered face held the expression of a man who had made his peace with what was coming. 2 weeks before Thomas Callaway died, Dawson said, his voice level and unhurried, "2 men I had never seen arrived at the railroad camp. They were not workers. They met with Mr. Ashton in his private tent for approximately 2 hours. When they emerged, one of them was smoking a pipe. Mr. Ashton instructed me that no one was to know about the meeting." Ashton rose from his chair. The courtroom saw something they had never seen from the smooth, controlled railroad president panic. "He's lying." Ashton's voice cracked with an urgency that shattered his polished facade. "Dawson was dismissed 6 months ago for theft. His testimony is worthless." Every person in the courtroom heard the mistake. Clara heard it. Booker heard it. Even Drake heard it, and the attorney's face went rigid with the realization that his client had just committed the most basic error a defendant can make, responding to testimony with specific denials that confirm knowledge. Dawson remained calm. "I was never dismissed," he said. "I resigned because I could no longer tolerate what I was seeing. I have the original resignation letter signed and accepted by Mr. Ashton himself." He produced the letter. Booker examined it and entered it into evidence. The damage was catastrophic. By claiming Dawson was fired for theft, Ashton had inadvertently confirmed that he knew Dawson knew about the meeting and felt threatened enough by the testimony to fabricate a smear on the spot. Drake moved to strike the exchange from the record, but the words had already been heard by every person in the room, and no legal motion could unhear them. Drake, sensing the ground dissolving beneath his client's case, played his final card. "Your Honor," he said, rising with the careful composure of a man handling explosives, "I must bring to the court's attention a matter of significant relevance. Mrs. Callaway, who has presented this case with such apparent conviction, is in fact Clara Whitfield, the daughter of Henry Whitfield, a Philadelphia attorney disbarred for financial fraud 10 years ago. Mr. Ashton was Mr. Whitfield's former business partner. Mrs. Callaway's presence in Montana, her marriage to Ethan Callaway, and her involvement in this case are all motivated by personal revenge, not the pursuit of justice. Every piece of evidence she has presented is tainted by this personal vendetta." Silence. Complete terrible silence. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. This was the attack she had feared most, the one she had lost sleep over, the one that could unravel everything she had built. The courtroom held its breath. Then a voice came from the back of the gallery, old, thin, but carrying the unmistakable ring of a man who had been waiting a very long time to speak. Her father was no fraud. Jedediah Patterson rose from the last row of seats. 72 years old, his back bent by decades of manual labor, but his eyes bright with the particular fire that comes from finally, after 15 years, being able to say what needed to be said. "Henry Whitfield was my lawyer in Philadelphia 15 years ago. He helped me keep my home when a bank tried to take it. He was the most honest man I ever knew in my life." Patterson pointed one gnarled finger at Ashton. "And Victor Ashton is the man who manufactured evidence to destroy him. I know because I was there. I saw the forged ledgers. I saw the witnesses who were paid to lie. I wanted to testify in Henry's defense, but my wife was dying of consumption, and I had to choose between fighting for a good man and caring for the woman I loved." His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the courtroom, every word was audible. "I chose my wife, and I have carried that shame for 15 years. He straightened his bent back as far as it would go, which was not very far, but was somehow more impressive than any soldier's posture. "I won't carry it anymore." Clara stood at the front of the courtroom with tears streaming down her face, but her back was straight and her chin was lifted because her father, Henry Whitfield, the man the world had forgotten and dismissed as a criminal, was being vindicated by a 72-year-old farmer in a Montana courthouse 15 years after his death. But Patterson was not alone. One by one, other families rose from the gallery benches. The Morrisons, whose ranch had burned under circumstances identical to the Callaway barn. Their patriarch stood and said, "Our barn burned in the night. 3 months later, we sold to the railroad for a quarter of what the land was worth, because we had no feed for our cattle and no money to rebuild." Widow Greer, a small woman with iron-gray hair and the calloused hands of someone who had run a farm alone after her husband's death, stood and said, "They told me I had no legal right to my land without a husband. Judge Crawford ruled against me without even reading my deed. I sold because I had no one to fight for me." A younger rancher named Hollis, who had lost 200 acres to an eminent domain claim he had never been given the chance to challenge, stood. Then a miner named Ferris, who had been cheated of a claim through a paperwork error that Crawford had refused to correct. Then a woman named Stokes, whose family had been evicted from their homestead through a tax lien that, as Clara now knew, had almost certainly been fabricated. Each story was a brick. Each voice was mortar. And the wall they built together was so high and so thick that no attorney, no matter how skilled, could climb over it or tear it down. Drake attempted to object. He cited relevance, prejudice, procedural irregularity. But Booker, who had watched the proceedings with the quiet attention of a man who understood that some moments transcend procedure, allowed each person to speak. "These testimonies go to the pattern of conduct," he ruled. "They are relevant to the question of intent." Ashton sat in his chair and watched his empire crumble. The smooth confidence was gone. The silver hair that had been perfectly combed that morning was now disordered, his hands having run through it repeatedly during the testimony. His expensive suit, which had never had a place in a cattle town, now looked like exactly what it was, a costume worn by a man pretending to be something he was not. When the testimony concluded, Clara presented the land patent one final time, holding it up so that every person in the courtroom could see the document that represented the Callaway family's legal right to their land, their gold, their home. "This patent," Clara said, and her voice had found something beyond steadiness, something that sounded like her father speaking through her across the years, was issued by the United States government to Ezra Callaway in 1855. It grants permanent, irrevocable ownership of 700 acres, including all mineral rights beneath the surface. It cannot be overridden by a county court eminent domain order. It cannot be invalidated by fabricated tax liens. And it cannot be ignored by any judge, no matter how many railroad shares he keeps in his coat pocket. The courtroom erupted. Ranchers applauded. Pearl Henderson shouted, "That's right," from the third row. Even Booker, who had maintained judicial composure throughout, allowed himself a small nod that Clara caught from the corner of her eye. Deputy Marshal Booker delivered his ruling. The Great Northern Mountain Railroad Company was permanently prohibited from approaching or claiming any portion of Callaway land. The federal land patent was confirmed as valid and enforceable. A full federal investigation was ordered into the activities of Victor Ashton and Judge Harlan Crawford, including charges of fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and suspicion of involvement in the death of Thomas Callaway. Ashton stood when the ruling was read. The man who had walked into this courtroom as the most powerful businessman in the county stood now as something else entirely, a defendant. His gray eyes found Clara across the courtroom, and in them she saw the recognition that comes only in the moment of complete defeat. He had lost not to money or power or violence, the weapons he understood, but to knowledge and truth, weapons he had always dismissed as irrelevant. "You are more like your father than you realize," Ashton said. His voice was quiet and bitter. "Mrs. Callaway," Clara corrected, "and I will take that as a compliment." Booker ordered both Ashton and Crawford into federal custody pending investigation. When the two men were led out of the courthouse, the entire town of Elk Ridge was standing in the street. Nobody cheered. Montana people do not cheer. But they nodded one by one in the quiet acknowledgement that justice, though late, had finally arrived. As Clara stepped outside into the cold air, old Patterson approached her. His bent frame moved slowly through the crowd, and people stepped aside for him with the instinctive respect that small communities show to their elders. He stopped before Clara looked up into her face with eyes that glistened but did not quite overflow, and said 5 words that broke her heart and healed it at the same time. "Henry would be so proud." Clara bit her lip to keep from sobbing. She managed to nod to take the old man's weathered hand to whisper, "Thank you." Then she turned and walked to where Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, waiting for her with the patience of a mountain. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply opened his arms, and Clara walked into them, pressing her face against his chest and letting the tears come. Not tears of sadness, tears of release. 6 years of carrying her father's injustice, 8 weeks of building a case that a single mistake could have destroyed, the accumulated weight of fear and determination and hope and exhaustion, all breaking free at once. Ethan held her. His arms were strong and warm and smelled of pine resin and leather and the cold Montana wind. He rested his chin on the top of her head and let her cry, and his heartbeat, slow and steady against her cheek, was the most reassuring sound Clara had ever heard. The weeks after the trial brought the kind of healing that does not happen quickly, but happens completely the way a broken bone mends stronger than the original. The gold deposit was officially confirmed by federal surveyors sent from Helena. The Callaway family, with Clara's legal guidance, negotiated a mining lease with a reputable company that Booker recommended, ensuring the family retained ownership of the land while earning royalties from the gold extraction. The income was enough to rebuild the barn by feed, to carry the cattle through winter, pay off the bank debt that had been hanging over the ranch like a headsman's axe, and invest in the improvements the property needed. But Clara insisted that the gold not change the fundamental nature of the ranch. "We are ranchers, not mining tycoons," she said during the first of a new tradition she established, Sunday evening family meetings around the kitchen table. "The gold stabilizes us. The ranch sustains us. The land is our home, not our treasury." Ethan nodded, and Clara saw in his eyes a respect that went deeper than admiration for her legal skills. She understood something that many people forget when fortune finds them, that dirt and labor are the foundation, not gold, and that a life built on work has a solidity that a life built on wealth can never match. Nate decided to stay. The announcement came without ceremony during supper one evening, between bites of Clara's beef stew. "I guess this place isn't as bad as I thought," he said, not looking at anyone, his ears turning red. It was the closest Nate Callaway would ever come to an apology, and Clara accepted it with the grace of someone who understood that for Nate, those 9 words represented an emotional journey equivalent to a cross-country expedition. The change in Nate had been building since Butte, but became visible in the weeks after the trial. He drank less, he worked more. He stopped picking fights in town and started picking up responsibilities on the ranch. One morning, Clara saw him in the horse barn, caring for a newborn calf that had been rejected by its mother bottle, feeding it with a patience and gentleness she had never imagined from the man who had once told her the wind would blow her away. When Nate realized Clara was watching, his face turned crimson, and he muttered something about, "Stupid animal won't eat on its own," but he did not leave, and he did not stop feeding the calf. Clara smiled into her hand and said nothing. Some transformations are best witnessed in silence. Silas found his peace, not through forgetting, which would have been dishonest, but through action, which was the only form of redemption that meant anything on the frontier. He became the most reliable man on the ranch, rising before dawn to check every fence, every gate, every window, as though through relentless diligence he could atone for the single night he had failed. He also began to sing while he worked songs that Thomas used to sing, and Clara understood that this was Silas's way of keeping his brother alive in daily memory. One afternoon, Silas sought Clara out in the kitchen. "Clara," he said, his voice unusually serious, "I never thanked you properly." Clara started to shake her head, but Silas stopped her. "No, listen, I drank because I couldn't face the truth. You came here and made all of us look the truth straight in the eye. It hurt, but it also set me free. I don't carry the guilt alone anymore. The whole family carries it together, and it's lighter." He swallowed. "Thomas should have lived long enough to meet you, but at least he left the family to the right person to find." Clara hugged Silas, the embrace of a sister-in-law, warm and uncomplicated. And Silas, for the first time since Thomas died, allowed himself to cry without hiding. Maggie stayed in Elk Ridge. She opened a small seamstress shop that Pearl Henderson promoted with characteristic enthusiasm, telling every customer who walked into the saloon that Maggie Pruitt makes the finest dresses between Helena and Butte, and that's a fact. Maggie and Clara became friends, connected by the man who had changed both their lives in different ways. Through Maggie's stories, Clara finally met the brother-in-law she had never known. Thomas's smile, his habit of reading aloud to young Nate by candlelight, his dreams for the ranch, his quiet courage. And through those stories, Clara felt the circle of family expand to include even the dead, because in a family that remembers, no one is ever truly gone. Hank Dawson, the railroad foreman who had risked everything to testify, was fired from Great Northern within days of the trial. Pearl Henderson hired him as a warehouse manager for the saloon supply operation. "At least he's honest," Pearl declared. "That's a higher standard than any boss he's had before." Dawson, the weary veteran who had spent years working for a man he despised because the world had not offered him a better choice, looked people in the eye for the first time in years without shame. Doc Warren retired with a clear conscience, having finally spoken the truth he should have spoken 8 months earlier. He told Clara, "You gave an old man the chance to do the right thing before it was too late. That's a gift I don't deserve, but I'm grateful for." Crawford was stripped of his judicial position and faced federal charges for bribery and obstruction of justice. Ashton was indicted on multiple counts: fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and suspicion of arranging Thomas Callaway's murder. The federal investigation expanded across state lines, uncovering the pattern of predatory land acquisition and intimidation that Thomas had described in his coded notes, a trail of victims and corrupted officials stretching from Montana through Wyoming and into Colorado. Henry Whitfield was vindicated, not through a formal legal declaration, which would take years of proceedings, but through the public acknowledgement that the man who had destroyed him was now in federal custody, exposed as the criminal Henry had always known him to be. The Helena Independent ran a story about the Elk Ridge trial, and in it, Patterson's testimony was quoted at length. When the news of her father's vindication reached Clara through a copy of the newspaper that Booker sent to the ranch, she sat alone on the front porch with the paper in her lap and the law book in her hands and cried. Not from grief and not from joy, but from relief. 6 years of carrying the weight of her father's wrongful disgrace, the whispered word fraud following her through the orphanage like a shadow, the knowledge that the man she loved most in the world had died with his name dragged through the mud. All of it lifted, not erased because some weights leave marks even after they are removed, but lifted, and the lightness that replaced them was unlike anything Clara had ever felt. Ethan found her on the porch, red-eyed but smiling. He sat beside her and said, "Your father would be proud." He said "your father" the way someone says "our father," as though Henry Whitfield now belonged to the Callaway family as much as to Clara. And in that small shift of pronouns, Clara heard the complete integration of her past into her present, her Philadelphia roots grafted onto Montana soil, two broken histories growing together into something new and whole. Spring came slowly to the Montana mountains, the way spring always comes to high country, in fits and starts with false warmth followed by late snowstorms, and then finally the irreversible turning of the season that fills the valleys with wildflowers and the creeks with snowmelt. Clara sat on the front porch of the Callaway Ranch on an April morning, her father's law book open on her lap but unread. She was writing a letter to the Territorial Attorney General's office proposing a legal aid program for farming families being pressured to sell their land by corporations. She did not have a law degree. She could not practice in any court. But she had knowledge, experience, and the understanding of what happens when poor people have nobody to speak for them before the law. Ethan came out with 2 cups of coffee. He set one beside her, looked at the letter and said, "Changing the world before breakfast. Just Montana. The world can wait until after lunch." He sat down beside her, his shoulder touching hers. The contact was habitual now, as natural as breathing, the physical manifestation of a connection that had grown so gradually and so steadily that neither of them could have named the exact moment it changed from arrangement to alliance to something far deeper. From the horse barn, Silas's singing drifted on the morning air. From the east pasture, Nate's silhouette moved along the fence line on horseback, checking posts and wire, his back straight and his head held high in a way that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. 3 brothers working their land under a Montana sky, and one woman who had crossed a continent to stand among them. "Ethan," Clara said, setting down her pen. Do you ever think about the day I arrived?" He was quiet for a time, the way he was always quiet before speaking, not because he had nothing to say, but because he respected words enough to choose them carefully. "Every day," he said finally, "and every day I thank Thomas. Thank Thomas for writing the advertisement." Ethan turned to look at her, and in the morning light, his eyes were warmer than she had ever seen them, warm enough to melt the last trace of ice that had once made them seem like the eyes of a stranger. "I never told you, but I didn't write the mail order notice. Thomas wrote it. Before he died. He told me I needed someone, that the ranch needed a woman, that I was killing myself trying to carry everything alone." He paused. "I found the notice in Thomas's papers after he was buried. Already written out but never mailed. I sent it because it was the last thing Thomas wanted me to do." Clara felt tears rise for what must have been the 1,000th time since she came to Montana. Thomas, the brother she never met, had brought her here from beyond the grave through a hastily written advertisement penned in the final days of his life. Even facing death, even knowing that dangerous men were closing in, Thomas Callaway had been taking care of his family. Not just protecting them from the present danger, but reaching forward into the future to give them what they would need after he was gone. "Thomas always knew what he was doing," Clara said softly. "He chose the right person." "He chose the right person," Ethan repeated. He leaned toward her and kissed her forehead. Gentle, slow. The same gesture he had made at their wedding, lips touching the same spot above her eyebrows. But the kiss was different now, carrying the weight of everything that had happened between then and this moment. Every battle fought, every truth uncovered, every night spent across the kitchen table, building a case that saved a family. Every small act of trust and courage that had transformed a business arrangement into a marriage, and a marriage into love. "I love you, Ethan Callaway," Clara said. The first time she had spoken those words to anyone in her life. Ethan did not answer with words. Ethan Callaway never answered with words when words were not enough. Instead, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her with the strength of a man who had spent his life lifting heavy things, and the tenderness of a man who had finally learned that some things must be held gently. Clara leaned against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady as sunrise, reliable as the mountains that surrounded them. From inside the house, Silas laughed at something. Nate called out a complaint about supper, the ordinary sounds of family life, the sounds that Clara Whitfield, Philadelphia orphan daughter of a disgraced lawyer mail-order bride, had once believed she would never hear directed at her or around her or because of her. She looked up at the Montana sky wide and deep and filled with the kind of light that exists nowhere else on earth, and thought about the people who had brought her to this porch on this morning. Her father, Henry Whitfield, who gave her knowledge and courage and died before he could see her use them. Thomas Callaway, who gave her a family from beyond the grave through a mail-order advertisement written on the last page of his life. Ethan, Silas, and Nate, three mountain men who had let a stranger into their home and discovered that she was exactly what they needed, though not one of them would have admitted it at the start. She thought about the law book sitting on the shelf inside next to the Callaway family Bible. Two books from two different worlds resting side by side on the same rough-hewn wooden shelf. Like Clara and Ethan. Like Philadelphia and Montana. Like grief and hope. Different origins, shared destination. The sun climbed higher over the Rocky Mountains, pouring golden light into the valley where the Callaway cattle grazed on new spring grass. Somewhere in that valley beneath the wildflowers and the rich, dark earth, gold waited in the rock. But the real treasure was not underground. It was sitting on a wooden porch, drinking coffee, watching the morning unfold over 700 acres of land that had been fought for, bled for, and saved by a combination of courage, knowledge, and the stubborn refusal to let powerful men take what did not belong to them. Clara Whitfield Callaway closed her eyes, felt the warmth of the sun on her face and the warmth of her husband beside her, and knew with the bone-deep certainty that comes only after great struggle that she had found the thing she had been searching for since the day her father died. Not revenge, not vindication, not even justice, though justice had been served. Home. She had found home, and it had been worth every mile.